morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. This is Big Bang Bungalow, where we are interviewing Kyle Alexander of Christian Idealism. Or Kyle Alander, sorry.
Yeah, Alander. People always get that confused, but
It's a salamander, but without.
yeah,
All right. So, how are you doing today, my good sir?
I'm good. Just been busy studying other things, but yeah. I run a YouTube channel. It's called Christian Idealism, and I just finished my series last week on my case for idealism. So I'm kind of done with that series. I'm going to move on to something else. But uh, but yeah, um, that's kind of what I
Yeah. So,
focus
just
my
to give our
time
listeners
on.
a rundown, what would you say exactly is idealism, and how would you distinguish that from materialism and so forth?
Well, idealism is it's more of a metaphysical position, right? So if you're a materialist, you think that all that exists is matter and the arrangements of it, and that everything kind of emerges from that, right? Like our mental states emerge from it, consciousness emerges from matter. Everything we see kind of is built up from like what's called physical primitives, right? So these physical primitives that exist in reality, that exist outside consciousness, they exist on their own, and they kind of create the reality we see around us. So it's not that consciousness creates reality, but rather, these physical primitives are the foundation of reality. Kind of everything's built from those things rather than something else. So that would be the materialist worldview, and that's the mainstream position among atheists. A lot of people like Richard Dawkins are materialists. Not all of them, but most of them are. Most atheists are materialists for an obvious reason, because you don't need God. Like if materialism is true, you don't need theism per se, because everything's just explained by matter, and that's it. Whereas idealism is the exact opposite. It actually claims that what we perceive as matter are really just mental states, but they're not our mental states per se. They're the mental states of God or universal consciousness or whatever. So, like, as an idealist, I accept that there is a reality beyond my mind, right? Like, beyond my own personal psyche or whatever you want to call it. But I don't think that you need to posit this extra ontology beyond the ontology of consciousness. So as an idealist, I would say that everything is the ontology of consciousness, essentially. Like everything's mental in nature. Even the physical objects that are around us are mental in nature. There's just, different configurations of mental things, so to speak. Um, so I use the analogy of like a dream, right? When you're dreaming, the stuff in your dream isn't really matter, so to speak. It's more like it's a projection of your subconscious, right? And in the same way, our world is a projection of consciousness, but not our consciousness, but universal consciousness. So that's kind of the distinction between, the both worldviews. Is under materialism, everything is matter. Under idealism, everything is mental. That's basically what it is. They're basically polar opposites of each other. So if you have any more questions about it, I mean, I know that's kind of like the brief introduction, but
Um,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, you know, I actually did prepare some questions for you, and yeah, and it's actually good that you brought up dreams, and basically this ties into morality and how it may tie into this. Uh, Basically, the question is, if we are ideas in the mind of God, wouldn't that imply God doesn't have moral obligations to us, similar to how you would say we don't have moral obligations to dream characters?
Well, that is a good question. I think under my view, I don't think you would have to accept moral realism within dreams, but you could accept moral realism in our world. So what that basically means is there are certain obligations that are objective, that are kind of like rules that God kind of has to follow on his. He doesn't have to follow them, but because he knows about them, right? Because I use Richard Swinburne's approach. So like because God's omniscient, because God is perfectly free, then he knows what moral obligations are, and so he will do those moral obligations. So it's not that he necessarily has to do it per se, but it's more like he chooses to do it for the sake of, the dream characters within his mind, so to speak. And there's also, we also need to remember that if we're all in the mind of God, then essentially each one of us has our own value sets of what we determine right from wrong, right? And so God is like has a universal value set, which is basically like all of our value sets, because we're within God's value set, is intersubjective within God's value set, so to speak. So you could say it's objective, right? It would be objective from our perspective, right? But not necessarily from his. It would be subjective, but you're still gonna have objective morality, even though it may not necessarily be totally objective, like how we.
It would sound like more like intersubjective in that part.
It would, yeah. It is intersubjective. Like I do admit that, I do admit that it's not totally objective. Like it's not truly objective, but it's more intersubjective. So, as an idealist, as for morality, I would say that morality is not subjective, but it's also not objective. It's more intersubjective, so to speak. Like it's subjective, but everybody within the mind of God would subconsciously kind of agree to that morality, so to speak. So it would be epistemically objective, but it wouldn't be ontologically objective, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, that makes sense, actually. I think that also makes sense in biblical terms because you do, like, the nature of the Ten Commandments as a legal policy, part of a, I can't pronounce it, treaty, does seem to go along with that, where the Ten Commandments don't necessarily apply to God himself, but rather they're rules that he lays out for other people to follow if they want to have a treaty with him.
Right, and well, because it's a covenant, right? So
Yeah.
in the old covenant, he set out rules, so to speak, and that would kind of be. Now, not all the rules are necessarily moral rules. Like some of the rules were more cultural, or they're more political, so to speak. So they weren't. Not all the rules in the Torah were like moral rules, so to speak. That's why when the new covenant came, that kind of changed a little bit. But yeah, I mean, as far as the Ten Commandments go, you could say that those were the rules at the time. It was the law at the time. Like if you read Romans 5, for example, it talks about how, the first, when the man sinned, so did all men. Well, it points out, I don't know, I think it's like, if you go to Romans 5:14 or 15:6, I don't know the exact verse. I know it's in Romans 5, but it mentions how there was sin before the law, but there was no law. It wasn't until Adam and Eve came around that they kind of set the law and standards, so that's when sin started to get counted. So you could say that like the old covenant was like the law that was placed on mankind to kind of, watch over sins, right? So sin still existed before the law, before God came around and set those rules, but those sins weren't counted because there was no law. It's like if you were driving down a intersection and let's say if there's no speeding limit. Well, at first you can go as fast as you want, right? You can go as fast, it doesn't matter. But once there's a law that says, okay, you can only go 70 miles an hour. Well, guess what? Now you have to only go 70 miles an hour because there's now a law in place that you can't go over 70 miles an hour. So it's the same thing with sin. It's like, yeah, people might have committed sin in the past, but there was no law that kind of kept track of those sins.
All right. So you got anything you want to share, Coates?
Carlos?
Yeah, Carlos.
See. Do you believe idealism helps make sense of the Bible?
It's hard to say. I would say I think it's neutral. I don't think it really helps. I think it could help in certain aspects. Like it might help explain Romans 1, for example. Because here's the thing is if you look at the universe from an idealist perspective, then it's pretty obvious that there is a God that exists, right? Because it's like, well, if everything is, mental in nature, then there has to be a mind that contains it. This mind is what we call God. And so, yeah, that would be kind of, it would make, in those aspects, yeah, you could make sense of the Bible. But I think for the most part, I think it's mostly neutral when it comes to like understand. Because if you want to understand the Bible, you don't go to idealism. You go to scholars and understand the historical context of what it's talking about and stuff like that. So, yeah.
I've always said that it might help in terms of thinking about, let's say, God's commands to wipe out the Canaanites and stuff like that. Because if you think about it like being in a dream world, we don't seem to have any problems with, let's say, me being in a lucid dream, telling one characters in my lucid dream to get rid of other characters in my lucid dream.
Maybe though, I would look. I think for that, I would recommend you go to like John Walton. He actually wrote a book on the Canaanites, and he argues that that event wasn't really historical, so to speak. It was more like
Polemical.
like it
It was
wasn't.
a
It
it was
didn't really happen.
it was a compression of loosely connected events into one epic story of one swift conquest of the Holy Land, which was an alternative narrative to Judges.
Right. So he argues that that event, the Canaanite event, didn't actually happen historically speaking. It was more of like a narrative to try to like explain what was going on. Like it wasn't a literal event that happened. It was more like this is kind of how the Israelites took over other lands, and it wasn't, so that's kind of, again, you'd have to go to John Walton for that. But
there was a cultural memory of the Habiru ransackings of Canaanite cities during the Amarna period.
yeah, right. So
And
well, I mean, I also like to bring up, like, because there is one common thing that I see apologists like Frank Turek, Clay Jones do, where they note that these apparent crimes of the Canaanites and stuff like that, where they said, well, they were sacrificing babies, they were incest, and all this stuff. When you go to John Walton, he said that's part of the invincible barbarian motif.
right. So
Where
again, yeah, you just go to John Walton. Again, I don't really look deep into that stuff. I mean, I've looked into it before, but I'm not like well versed in it. So for that, I would just tell people just go to John Walton, and he'll kind of explain like his interpretation of the text or whatever in light of its ancient context. So
all right. So, what got you an inspiring philosophy together? You know, we've had Michael Jones on before, and I've talked to you before, and you guys have seemed to be in a sort of working relationship with each other. How did that all come about?
well, first of all, it started off. I subscribed to his channel and I watched some of his videos. At first, I was kind of just an ordinary subscriber, and then what happened was there was a YouTuber by the name of Chocolate Hat that
that guy
tried to debunk IP's videos, or at least one of the videos. I think it was, yeah, he tried to debunk. He like made a series on it, and so I decided, all right, I'm gonna go in there and write a blog in response to this guy. So I did, and that's when me and IP started, working together. Because I wrote the blog, responding to Chocolate Hat, kind of saving Michael time, right? Because then he didn't have to do it. So that's when we became friends on Facebook, and then we started working together and stuff like that. But
I've recently seen his debate with Dr. Joe Boot, and that was the most hilarious debate I've ever seen in a long time.
Do what?
Dr. John Boot, like a young Earth creationist.
Oh yeah.
I thought that was hilarious because like an hour and 6 minutes in, he basically dropped a mic, like he legitimately dropped a mic after IP had said that evolution is a theory, and he took that as interpreting that he interpreted that as a contradiction to when IP had said that evolution is a scientific fact, because he doesn't know what the hell a scientific theory is.
No, because there are multiple theories of evolution, not just one theory.
Well, I mean, he forgets that, he forgets what a scientific theory actually is, and this whole notion of a theory being just a guess is actually anachronistic to the historical usage of the word theory. All right, so let me see another question. Oh, yeah. What are your views on afterlife, and how do you tie them in with idealism?
My views are, I'm a Christian first of all, so eventually I do think that like we all will get this, you know, resurrected body, right? So in terms of like the future of the afterlife, the afterlife, I think we're gonna be here on Earth. We're just gonna have resurrected bodies. But in terms of like what happens right after we die, I actually think that I take a unique approach to this. So I don't take the approach because if here's the thing is some Christians will take the sleep body approach where like when you die, your soul kind of like sleeps until you get resurrected. Other Christians think that like when you die, you go straight to heaven. I don't take any of those approaches. For me, what I say is when you die, your brain. Okay, so in order to understand the afterlife, we need to first understand the mind body problem. Okay, because that's the only way we can really understand like what's going on. So, as an idealist, I would say that our brain is basically what's called a disassociated alter of consciousness. So our brain kind of like sets the boundaries for how far our consciousness can interact with the world, right? And our bodies as well. Like because the world that we live in is kind of mental itself, because we live in a dream world, so to speak. Our bodies set the boundaries for how far our consciousness can kind of like relate to that. So when we die, that disassociation kind of dies with it, but our consciousness doesn't die. In fact, under the idealist view, when you die, your inner life sort of grows, so to speak. Like, think of like when you take a psychedelic drug, for example. Okay, when you take a psychedelic drug, like let's say LSD or acid or magic mushrooms or whatever you want to call it, um, your inner life will increase, right? So you'll experience more, and that's because what the drug is doing, it's breaking down the disassociation, and so when we die, that disassociation will break, and then once that breaks, then our inner life will kind of expand after death. So we kind of experience like this psychedelic trip, so to speak, but it's a much more powerful one that drugs couldn't really do. Otherwise, we would die, of course. But so I think like once we die, we actually enter this psychedelic trip, and I can't say what's gonna happen because I haven't died, but I think that we get what's called we get a new sense of identity. We get reintegrated memories. We get like this broader sense of ourselves after we die. We don't really go anywhere, so to speak. We just kind of like have these experiences, and then once we get resurrected bodies, then we'll go back to you know that point. But in between the time of when we die here on Earth and when the resurrection occurs, we're kind of like in this psychedelic state, so to speak.
So what do you think? What do you think the world will look like after we resurrect? And
I don't know. I have no idea. It could look the same. It might look different. Because I don't know when the resurrection is going to occur. So I don't, because I'm a not post millennial. I'm a partial preterist. So I think that like most of the events in the Bible already happened. Most of the prophecies already occurred. So I think that we already moved past the Antichrist and stuff like that.
you think it'll be a parallel universe or something like that?
Yeah, I don't know about that, but I think something like that probably. I think that the world probably will look different. I think like we might be able to like certain animals even today like have senses that we don't have. Like they have mental states that we don't have as humans. So I think that like it's very possible that we could acquire new mental sensations in the afterlife that we don't currently experience now, and that's why it might actually the world might actually look better in the afterlife than it does now. But
Well, as long as you remember, Donald Trump will be there.
No, Barack
Okay.
Obama will be.
Yeah. But essentially, my view of the afterlife is once we die, we go into like the psychedelic state or whatever, and then once after the psychedelic state is over, then then our disassociation starts again, and we get new bodies essentially. So that's kind of my view.
That's interesting. All right. What are your thoughts on methodological naturalism and the differences between the supernatural and the natural?
I think it needs to be destroyed. I think that methodological. It depends on how you define it. So you have to be very careful on how, if you're just talking the scientific method, then yeah, I'm for methodological naturalism. But if you're talking trying to interpret science in a naturalistic way or a materialistic way where you assume that naturalism is true and so no evidence could ever favor any other position, then no, I think methodological naturalism is stupid. It really depends on how you define it. But if we're talking just the scientific method, again, I support methodological naturalism. But if we're talking interpreting science in a way that's materialistic, then I don't support it because it's obviously has its flaws. So for me, I wouldn't really use that term. I would go for more of like what I call an open methodological naturalism, where you don't assume materialism, but you do assume that you can have an understanding of the world, right? So once you make the assumption that okay, I can understand how the world works, then you investigate and you go wherever the evidence leads. And if it leads to something that's not a materialistic worldview or that's not the naturalistic worldview, then you accept it because that's where the evidence leads. Okay. Like if we find out, for example, that consciousness is not produced by the brain, okay, then you accept that conclusion based on the evidence. It's not because, oh well, maybe we haven't found something in the brain, or maybe we don't fully understand how the brain works yet, so we can't explain consciousness. No, you don't do that. You base your conclusions off of the evidence because your methodology is open toward any view of the world, regardless if that's materialism, idealism, or whatever.
Yeah, but don't you know that if I hit you over the head with a baseball bat repeatedly, eventually your speech, your memory will go down. So doesn't that show that materialism is true? Wouldn't it be the case
No,
that if I hit you over the head, like on the soul view, that if I hit you over the head repeatedly with a baseball bat, everything would just be intact, you would just be bloody?
well, you could use that argument, but what if you go into someone's dream and you start hitting them with a bat? Does that mean the dream world is material? No, of course not. Again, we need to understand what is the ontology of nature. If nature is all mental, then of course hitting me with a bat's gonna hurt my mental state because the bat itself is mental. So just as when I, like, for example, when I have certain thoughts, I will have certain emotions, right? So certain thoughts will affect my mood, my behavior, so on and so forth. Well, in the same way, if everything's mental, then if you hit me with a mental bat, so to speak, then it's going to affect my mental life because it's all mental in nature. So there's no like, oh well, I'm gonna, hit the bat or whatever. Like if everything's mental, then of course hitting me with the bat's gonna hurt because my head, my inner life is also mental. Okay, so I understand where that objection was going to, but yeah, that's not really a very good argument against idealism. But
What do you consider the
That has to do with the mental diseases, or you could say brain diseases in your case, like such as Alzheimer's and so forth, where we see a degradation in the brain, and that's left a lot of materialists to assume that that the mind has to be material, because if it weren't, we wouldn't notice the difference between a degrading mind and a mind that's where the faculties are, like that are just going away.
Right.
To be some connection.
Well, there's actually been a few studies about how dementia patients have a broader sense of inner life. They just can't really express it, so to speak. Um, so, that's also controversial, right? That kind of argument. But another thing you need to remember is when it comes to dementia, again, we're talking about mental states. So if your brain is itself mental and if your body's mental, then of course it's going to affect your inner life, right? And so, and of course, there's going to be like cognitive behaviors that are going to decrease, someone's awareness or whatever. So that's why when it comes to things like that, when it comes to things like dementia, I make a distinction between what's called consciousness proper and self-reflexive consciousness. So I actually had a video on this way back. And basically, the distinction is that there's a difference between an experience of something and knowing about that experience. So, like, for example, we have dreams every night, but we don't always remember those dreams. In fact, we do have dreams every night, but we don't always remember them, right? We don't have a lucid dream every night. Like, I've lucid dreamed a few times, but I don't, sometimes, even when I'm lucid dreaming, I don't remember all the details afterwards, right? Even though I had that sort of experience. And so I would say,
There's some people who claim to never dream.
right. Well, here's the thing is all human beings do dream. They just don't, not all human beings remember their dreams.
I have off-the-wall dreams. I remember most of them.
And so because we need to make that distinction, because if we're going to say that, oh, you don't remember your dreams, well, therefore you didn't experience them. Well, that doesn't make any sense, because you did have a dream and you did experience it, but you don't remember the dream you had, right? So the dream you had is an experience in and of itself. Whereas if you self-reflexively know about the dream, that's something a little different. That's something that's like, okay, I know that I'm Kyle. I know that I'm having this experience of being Kyle or whatever. That's a little different than the actual experience of being Kyle, right? So I could be Kyle without actually knowing of being Kyle. So in the same way, dementia patients, they can have the experience of being themselves, but they don't have the knowledge or the self-reflexive awareness of being themselves. So that's why it's kind of difficult for them to like communicate with other people, and that's why like they typically like will shut down and have very poor mental skills. It's not because they lack inner life, so to speak. It's more because they just lack the ability to self-reflexively express themselves to other people. So
what do you consider the best refutation for the conclusions of uber materialists like Sean Carroll, who many village atheists claim he's disproven the afterlife?
Yeah, well, he uses a pretty interesting argument against dualism, but I don't think he's disproven the afterlife, because like physics doesn't. Okay, if we're gonna assume a dualistic picture to reality for a second here, physics by definition cannot affect the mental world. Okay, so it can't really conclude that there is no afterlife if the mental world is kind of separate from the physical world. So again, you could argue from the interaction problem, but that's not really a good argument against, because I think he's kind of assuming that like consciousness is like in the material universe, which I don't think it really is. I think it's actually more fundamental than space-time itself. So he's assuming that consciousness is like within space-time, whereas as an idealist, I would say that consciousness is more fundamental than space-time. So you're not going to really find consciousness in space-time. It's going to be more fundamental to it. And so yeah, I don't think his arguments really work, but it is what it is.
Yeah. Would you say that now since we got onto the scientist, there is often a claim that is made that if aliens were discovered, that would completely destroy religion and Christianity. How would
Um,
you respond to that?
it would destroy certain religions, but not. I wouldn't say it destroys Christianity. Um, it's
That's the
actually
definition of a non sequitur.
well. That's the thing is it doesn't really make any sense because Christianity doesn't make any claims about extraterrestrials, right? So it doesn't deny.
Outside that they built the pyramids.
It doesn't deny that there are other beings that exist in our universe, right? It doesn't deny that there could be other life out there, including intelligent life. So I don't really see how that's really a good argument against
Like,
Christianity. Now,
do
against
you
other
suppose,
religions, I can't really say, but
do you suppose there was incarnation of the logos on each of those life inhabited worlds?
so like a different character of Jesus on each of the
Yeah.
worlds. I would have to look at their doctrines, and you would also have to look at the historical evidence that they would have for their religion, and you would also have to look at like again the evidence and a prior arguments they may give for their version of God, or again you would just have to look into the evidence. It's just like how we investigate religions on Earth. Like we have to look at the evidence, right? We have to look at the history. Where did it start? Where did this happen? Where did that happen? It's the same thing with other planets. If there were other religions out there, so to speak, again, you would just have to investigate and see, okay, well, how does this compete with my worldview? So that's
I always like to think about, well, I always like to tell atheists that have that, well, what if they went to an alien planet and the aliens there just said, wait, you guys are saying that you guys also believe that a God man got crucified as well? We've been have that. I wonder what their response would be.
that's the thing. That very could possibly be the case. So again, you would have to like look. And here's the thing: if it's all the same, right? Like if you go to different planets and they all have this religion that's very similar to Christianity, well, what if it's the same God? You know, like I mean, what are you gonna do then? Like then the argument doesn't really work because now you actually just show that Christianity is even more probable now because it seems to show up in other planets. So, but yeah.
Given an infinite multiverse, there is going to at least be some planets that have Christianity on them.
Right.
So, all right. So,
What is an area of disagreement you find yourself with other Christians?
Probably has to do with more Protestantism and definitely sola scripture. Like I think sola scripture is wrong. I don't think scripture is I think it's an authority, but it's not the ultimate authority, and it's definitely not the only authority when it comes to theological or you know theological matters. So when it comes to claims about God or the afterlife or whatever, the Bible is an authority, but it's not the only authority. It's not like the sole authority, and that seems to be my disagreement among a lot of Protestants. And so I'm kind of like moving away from Protestantism more. I think
Good
it's
for you.
very bad, even though I don't like to use that word. But I think I wouldn't say it's all bad, but I think a lot of it is bad, especially Calvinism.
It was needed at the time, and then it just got out of hand.
Right, and so now it's like it's turned into like this fundamentalism that I don't like, and that's why I'm leaning more towards things like Catholicism, for example.
Yeah, you flirted with the idea of becoming a Catholic. Like, do you think your hatred for natural law theory would make it harder for you to become a member of Catholicism?
No, because not really, because natural law theory is not really a Catholic doctrine, so to speak. It's more of an ethical theory. So yes, while it's true that mostly Catholics are the ones that propose natural law theory, I wouldn't really have a problem being a Catholic and rejecting natural law theory because you don't have to accept natural law theory to be a Catholic. In fact, most Catholics don't accept it. I think it's like 70% of Catholics use birth control, at least in America. So, I mean, that right off the bat shows that you
Well,
don't
then again,
have to
a good
accept.
portion of
Oh
Catholics.
yeah, they're often
Well,
yeah, Catholic missionaries are often blamed for the reason why Africans refuse to wear condoms.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, but I mean, when it comes to natural law theory, um, I think that's a separate issue, and I'm not going to dwell on it if I become a Catholic. Like, I'm not going to really. It's if for whatever reason if I become a Catholic, I'm gonna be more on the liberal side of Catholicism. Like, I'm gonna support birth control. I'm gonna support that priests should get married. Stuff like that. So I don't have to accept natural law theory, but
Well, yeah, definitely
don't
appreciate.
you realize that if don't you realize that the reason why that there's a pedo scandal is because Catholic priests can't get married?
That came later. Like the
yeah.
earliest priests were married.
No, I know, right? And I mean,
Well, I mean, it's funny about that whole theory. It'd be like, as codes got into with the whole African and contraception and AIDS sort of thing. I actually have looked into that, and it's actually pretty funny because you got guys like Tony Simpson, I believe his name is, who has worked in the Zimbabwe region and has expertise in Catholicism in Africa. And he more or less says that the culture in Africa has long not wanted contraception with regardless of Catholicism, mainly because of sexism. And the men just simply don't like the feeling of condoms. And that's sort of been a thing that's been present, but way before Catholicism has been around there.
right. Well, I would say a lot of it is cultural or culture. So, yeah, I don't think I wouldn't really. I don't want to like hit natural law theorists on the head, um, but yeah, I mean, a lot of that whole issue, it's not really their fault. It's more like the culture didn't accept it, so whatever. I mean, it's their culture, so whatever. But
I think you would have some agreement with natural law theorists who bring about the whole unitive function of marriage and the complementarian role between men and women.
that is the one thing I do agree with natural law theory on is the unitive nature of marriage. Um, I think that marriage should be, theologically speaking, between a man and a woman, though politically speaking, I think gay people should have the right to marry. I don't even think the government should be involved in marriage. Honestly, if I'm gonna
Agreed.
if I'm gonna be consistent, I don't think the government should be involved in marriage at all. So, if gay people want to get married, fine, let them. I may not agree with it theologically, right? But I'm going to support their ability to get married. Okay,
Well, I mean,
so
I've
that's
always said
kind of
like
my
this.
stance.
Of course, gay people should have the right to get married. They should be able to suffer like the rest of us.
Right. So I mean, it's for me. It's like I don't really understand why certain Christians want to try to limit, gay people from getting married. It's like why should it matter? Like it shouldn't matter. Like yeah, you don't have to agree with homosexuality to be a Christian. Like you could disagree with them while not attacking them, and I think that's the important thing.
Well,
So
yeah, there is
we
a
should.
yeah, because there is a fringe minority of Christians that actually do take Leviticus and stuff way too seriously, and they actually advocate like if you go to trying to think the Steven Anderson crowd,
Right.
who actually believe that the government should be stoning gay people and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
which I think honestly, I think Christians need to be more against him than homo. I think he's a bigger problem when it comes to morality and being a Christian. I think people like him are a bigger problem than homosexuals.
Pretty much, I agree. Me and Codes and a friend of ours named Robert Freed actually did an entire discussion going around our complete dislike and our like disownment of him and his cult. Um,
But you also got the opposite cult, the Pumpkin Squad. In
so
react reaction to what his colleagues said about that about Mr. Atheist being the pumpkin being he's the biggest fruit since the pumpkin. Like, well, yeah, he is a fruit, but that's besides the point.
Well, I mean, it's just a big all balloon to say with this group. I've always been outspokenly against the Steven Anderson types, especially, and also the Kent Hovind types. Although I also do joke with inspiring philosophy, where I say, haven't you noticed that the only two PhD people that you've debated have been Kent Hovind and Joe Boot, who are both young Earth creationists? And I always joke with inspiring philosophy. I said, how does it feel like to knowing you'll always be on your record that your first PhD candidate that you debated was Kent Hovind?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like that's like the last, that would be like the most horrible thing to have on my record, is that be my first PhD candidate I actually took on.
Well, his first crackpot candidate was Giles Engineer, who himself
Oh,
who himself got beat by Hovind.
Well, I mean, Godless Engineer, in my opinion, his debating tactic is so bad that I do sincerely believe that you could put him against a broom and a candy bracelet and he would still find a way to lose. He just does not know really anything that he talks about at all. Especially when it comes to the mythicism, which
There's
all about.
There's a Christian YouTuber that responded to him on mythicism. He's like, one of the worst arguments against Christianity. Number 2, mythicism. He's like, there are kooky mythicist theories out there, but my mythicism is based on reason and facts and evidence.
I mean, that's sort of like how a young Earth creationists say, well, yeah, we admit that like that's actually enters in Genesis' position. Yeah, we know that there's kooks like Kent Hovind out there, but we're the good and rational young Earth creationists. I'm like, no, you're just one different kook of another different kook.
Anyway, we're getting out in the weeds here. When do humans get a soul, in your view?
Like, are you talking about when they're born, or like? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so are you talking about when someone's born, or are you talking like the conception period, or are you talking about like the history of?
When do you think
that's a lot of objections that atheists might have. They'll say, well, we've been around, like humans have been around for hundreds of thousands of years, well, depending on how you define human, but you can go from hundreds of thousands to millions depending on how you define human. But they'll say, at what point in that time frame did God magically imbue the soul onto humans?
Well, actually, I'm not a dualist, so I actually don't think that that's how God creates souls, where he just kind of throws them into bodies and whatever. I actually think souls. So, like I said earlier, how our brains are like dissociated alters of consciousness. Well, us as human beings and other animals, we're disassociated aspects of universal consciousness. So think of you. Are you guys aware of what disassociation actually is?
Yes.
Okay, so like disassociation is like when someone has dissociative identity disorder and they have like multiple personalities, different persons within their minds that's kind of like broken up, right? So we're kind of like disassociated aspect or disassociated alters of universal consciousness. And so I actually don't think that I think the way that God created human beings is kind of the same way that how we would create our dream characters, where it's not that they just necessarily appeared just like that. It's more of like they're extensions of ourself. And so we're kind of like extensions of God, so to speak, in that sort of weird way.
Aren't angels supposed to be extensions of God? Or Elohim?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, is all angels, demons, human beings, animals, we're all like extensions of God, essentially. Now, we're not God himself, but we're kind of like, we're the dream characters within himself. So like he's imagining us to exist, and then we exist, and so on and so forth. So I don't think that God just, threw souls into bodies and that's it. Like, no, if the universe is mental, then you would already begin life conscious. You would already begin life as, a dissociated alter. So that's
Well,
what
I
I
mean,
would say.
wouldn't it also sort of like to say that there was an actual moment where just God just pooped the soul in there. I mean, wouldn't that also just assume sort of a theory presentist sort of view? Where
Maybe.
on the B theory, it would say the moment that God imbued the soul is equally real to now and the day before.
Right. So I've actually thought about, because there's actually a question that really gets me to think, and the question is, did we exist before we were born? And or like what we were doing, what was our mind doing before we were born? Um as an idealist, I would say that we actually did exist before conception, but not in our current state. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is, I think that before we were born, we were actually one with universal consciousness. And then once we were conceived, then we became a disassociated alter of that universal consciousness. And then we created our own separate mental life, our own separate identity, so on and so forth. And then when we die, we kind of re enter into that state temporarily. And then we become disassociated again into resurrected bodies. So I think that before we were born, we kind of did exist, but not in the way like we like I don't believe in reincarnation, so I don't think that like we had a past life or a past self existed. It's not like I didn't exist in the 1800s, right? It's not like I existed as someone else in the 1800s. It's more like my consciousness wasn't disassociated yet, and so I was kind of like one with universal consciousness. And then when I was conceived is when I um, became a dissociated alter of universal consciousness. Um, so I don't think that God just snapped his fingers and creates souls. I think it's more like he takes a part of himself or a part of his consciousness and creates, other living creatures other than himself, other beings other than himself. So again, just kind of like go back to the analogy of a dream, right? The dream characters, when you're dreaming at night, they're actually conscious, but they're not really you, so to speak. They're more like extensions of yourself. So that's kind of how we are to God. We're kind of like extensions of God, so to speak. Now, we're not part of his divine essence, but we're part of his what's called his energy. So I also make that distinction, where we're not part of God's essence in the sense of how he's omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, so on and so forth. We're part of what's called his energies, and that kind of radiates out from his essence. And so that's kind of how I would explain how God creates souls. But whatever.
Yeah, I go into the whole B theory of time and stuff like that because that does tend to be, if you're a William Lane Craig fan, you're sort of like a lot of the fanboys of his, they're dogmatic atheist.
Right.
And they'll say, well, if you believe in the B theory of time, then you obviously can't believe that the universe began to exist, which is a non sequitur. I mean, the universe on a B theory can be said to begin to exist if you simply define beginning like as the event of the Big Bang.
Right. And
like I like to make this example. I like to give this example. The day before I was born, the day like on a B theory, the day before I was born, the day I was born, and the day after I was born, like they're all equally real.
right.
Equally real, but we're simply indexing them. But we can still say the day I was born is the day that I objectively began to exist. In that
funny,
time, in that index.
well, it's funny that you bring up B theory because like people like here's the thing, when it comes to, like, for example, the Kalam argument, you'll see people like for example the Craig versus Sean Carroll debate, where you'll have two different, philosopher William Lane Craig and a physicist Sean Carroll argue whether or not the universe began to exist. And as an idealist, I don't really care if the universe began to exist or not. The universe could be eternal, right? And that's because I think the universe kind of emerges from consciousness. So even if the universe is eternal, so even if I accept, like, for example, a cyclic universe model where kind of like the Big Bang happens and then, the universe gets created and then the universe goes through its cycles and then it collapses back on itself and then another Big Bang happens. Again, I don't really care what model. I don't care what any eternal universe model says. I can accept it as an idealist because I think the universe itself is kind of emergent from consciousness.
That
And
is actually
so,
a Thomistic view, if you can go into that with a contingency, where it doesn't so matter how long the universe has lasted. It matters more of whether the universe is contingent.
right, exactly. So
So if
even
the
if the universe existed
universe,
forever,
yeah,
okay, it's still contingent on God. It doesn't matter if the universe began to exist or not. And that's why, as an idealist, I don't really care about whether or not the universe began to exist or whether or not it's eternal. Like, that's completely irrelevant to my metaphysical beliefs. So
yeah, so we're almost coming up on the hour mark. I was saying we haven't got a chance to really talk as much in this episode, Carlos. What do you have to say to include with our guest here?
So basically, everything is just it's not the Matrix simulation, but rather God's mind, God's this super entity thinking about all this happening.
right, it's more like a dream, so to speak. So it's still real, right? Like,
Yeah.
everything's mental, but it's not this reality. It's not like God created this reality that's outside himself. Everything's still
Sounds like
within.
something out of a Lovecraftian novel.
I mean, here's the thing. I actually like Lovecraftian horror. I don't have his books, but I do watch a lot of YouTube videos and I read a lot of blogs on his stuff. And I think there's like one of the stories is about like different monsters thinking of other monsters, and then when you get to the top level, it's this monster kind of thinking reality into existence. Now, I wouldn't think of God like that, but yeah, I mean, it kind of is that sort of the dream world, so to speak. Or think of, like, for example, Inception, right, where everything is mental, everything's like this in this dream world, and so
That movie was trippy. I had to watch that a few times to get it.
yeah, so that's another kind of pop culture thing you can understand the idealist metaphysics from, is kind of like the dream world and so on and so forth. It's very interesting because, like, as an idealist, like, the world we live in is technically a dream. Like, there's no ontological distinction between the dreams that we have at night and the external world that we experience every day in our lives. The only real difference is who is the dreamer, right? When we're dreaming at night, we're the dreamer. In our world, God is the dreamer. And so that's how I see it, but in simplistic terms. But yeah.
Or it's yeah, in that one Inception they had there's layers upon layers upon layers of
Yeah, and
dreams.
that's the thing. There could
There's
actually
one
be
dream world.
layers upon layers of universes. Like, there could be universes above ours or below ours. I don't really know, but it's very
Go from
possible.
one dream to another dream world and another dream world and
all
Right.
the way down.
yeah.
It's all turtles all the way down.
So
I was wondering, since you have, how would this work in terms of sin?
Oh yeah, and this one one of the trippiest movies you'll see is Lucy, where she takes all those this drug that nobody's ever heard of, and then at the end she goes back in time and space and goes all the way back to the Big Bang. And I guess the moral of the story is that when you take enough drugs, you'll think you're God.
Which has been my experience.
yeah.
But yeah, like I was getting onto, like, well, how would this really work with the notion of sin? Because, if obviously humans have sinful thoughts and we're all like a part of God, wouldn't that also mean that God has sinful thoughts in the way?
No, actually, I've actually talked to Johanna Rath about this, and that's not really the case because sin or badness or whatever you want to call it is more. It's like it's a privation of the good. So God in His moral perfection, like here's an analogy. You can think of Hitler, right? You can dream about Hitler doing, the Holocaust, but that doesn't mean that you're bad, right? That doesn't mean you're Hitler. Well, it's the same thing. Just because God's imagining bad things to happen, or, just because he allows it to happen, doesn't mean that he's the one causing it to happen. And so that would actually require a whole different new episode to kind of explain my concept of free will and sin and evil, stuff like that.
I
But
mean, I've always put it with free will is because this is a typical thing is where I'd like to disconnect free will from. Well, I mean, obviously we disagree on free will because I've actually made an entire series going over that. But I remember, like for Christians, I would say the best bet could be to distinguish between causing something and knowing something.
right,
Like
so
I've
God can
know
know.
to eat dinner in about 5 minutes, but that doesn't mean I'm causing my dinner to be made.
Right, exactly.
Or like, I can call an app for pizza, and
And
I
the
can
other
know that
and
it's going to be.
here's the other thing about God, free will and stuff, is that since we're disassociated aspects of God, God technically doesn't really control us because we have our own mental lives, like we have our own inner life, and so like we could make decisions without the grand mind or God making the decision, right? So we can actually self-cause ourselves to make decisions and have free will, while God also has his distinct free will. So everyone can have their own sort of free will. And because we're disassociated alters. And so that's why I don't think God really causes things to happen. Um, but yeah, that would
All
require
right.
a whole new episode, but whatever.
Well, that is pretty good. I actually do
Okay,
find that interesting. Oh, you still
go
there?
ahead. Go ahead.
All right. So this is the last question before we head out. What do you got planned for future videos?
My next series is going to be quantum hermeticism. I'm going to derive the
Hermeticism,
seven.
you said?
Yep, I'm going to derive the 7 hermetic principles from quantum physics and modern science. Basically, I'm going to show that hermeticism is true, or not. You know, I mean, I'm going to show at least the principles behind it are true. Not, I don't know about the religion itself, but I mean, when it comes to the principles behind Hermeticism, the famous 7 Hermetic principles, I'm gonna derive all of them from modern physics, and that'll be my next series.
So, you believe there's this figure Hermes Trismegistus?
Well, that's the historical character. I don't know whether or not he existed. Some historians dispute that. I'm not gonna really focus on the historical aspect yet. I'm gonna focus more.
Wasn't he a synchronized deity that contacted Pythagoras or something?
Yeah, I don't know, but I'm gonna derive the 7 hermetic principles. I'm not gonna really focus on the history yet. I'll do that for a later documentary, but I'm gonna focus more on the principles themselves and actually derive them from physics and show that they're very much true of our reality. So
That is pretty good. So we're going to be working on that. And so, can you tell our audience where they can find you at if they want to contact you and if they want to just learn more about you and what you do?
yeah, so you can find me on Christian Idealism. I have about right now I have like 600 subscribers, I think. And then if you go on my page or my YouTube channel, you go to the about page. I have a message there on where my email is. It's called massapologist@gmail.com, and you can email me there, and I'll answer. I try, so it might take me like a few hours or a few days to respond, but I'll try to respond to any questions that people might have.
What's
Um,
that email again?
maskapologist@gmail.com.
Mass apologist or masked?
Mask, so like a mask and an
Yeah.
apologist, yeah,
Oh.
at gmail.com. So you can email me there, and I'll try to answer any questions I have. But yeah.
All right. Well, that's good. And we've come up on our hour mark.
Okay, this has been Big Boogaloo, and see you next time.